I can invite you to find a seat, we'll start in just a minute. Great, welcome here, friends. Welcome to Regent College to a book launch. These are important events in the life of the college, especially a book like the one we're celebrating tonight by Cindy Aalders. The kind of scholarship that goes into a book like this, it is one of the hidden assets of the college. We have assets like this building that we're very aware of, but the underground assets, what intellectually funds everything we do, is the hidden depths of scholarship that just go on quietly that you don't often see. You see your faculty teaching, you see us doing various things around and about, but the quiet work of scholarship goes on, and it's really out of that comes the whole mission of the college and all that we do. So it's a wonderful event when we can celebrate a book like this, when we can launch a new book, send it on its way. It feels like a ship. We should have some champagne that we crash against the book or something and send it on the way. But our structure tonight, I'll make a few remarks by way of introduction. Cindy will come and speak for about 45 minutes or so. I'll give a few comments by way of response, and then we'll open it up for questions. So when it comes time for questions, there's a microphone at the back. You can speak into the microphone so people on the recording, on video can hear the question. And then afterwards, we have tea and scones. So how special is that? And appropriate for, in all sorts of ways, for the subject of the book, as convivial as it is and sociable. Cindy Aalders is the faculty librarian here at Regent College. She holds the rank of Associate Professor of the History of Christianity, and she has a very long association with the college. Her first book that I'm very familiar with is To Express the Ineffable, the Hymns and Spirituality of Anne Steele, and it's still in print with Whip and Stock, originally published by Paternoster in 2008, and it was her THM thesis here at Regent College. And tonight we're celebrating the spiritual lives and manuscript cultures of 18th century English women. I'm very jealous of how beautiful this cover is. This is just a stunning cover, and it's by that obscure academic publisher, Oxford University Press. And the subtitle, Writing Religious Communities. But just before Cindy comes, I thought by way of introduction, I'm going to break the fourth wall tonight. I looked on my computer, and I have written, I think, 12 or 15 references for Cindy Aalders over the years. And so these are private, a PhD student, you sign away your right to, for privacy or whatever, to read these references. So these are entirely private. I'm going to read to you a reference I wrote for Cindy Aalders. And it'll say something of the esteem we have for her. This was about 10 years ago, and I wrote for one of the grants that she was applying for. I said, I know Cindy and her work well. I am also very aware of the project that she is engaged in. I've known Cindy for many years, having had her in lecture classes and supervised her THM thesis at Regent College. She is by far the most capable graduate student I've ever had in some 20 years of teaching. After the completion of her THM degree, she continued to work with me on various projects as a research assistant, and her work was impeccable. I was able to give her research problems, not just research tasks. And she handled these very capably, both intellectually and administratively. She would come back with the pertinent bibliography, summaries, lines of inquiry to follow up, and she's been a pleasure to work with. I have complete confidence in her as a researcher. You would find her careful and exacting in all her work. Her work ethic is unimpeachable. She possesses personal initiative, discipline, and the follow-through to do independent research easily. She works well with others, even though she has a quiet personality. Cindy has had an extensive experience now with manuscript research, chiefly in the 18th century, and I worked with her on some of this and followed her work as a doctoral student at Oxford. A few years ago, I was working on a private archive at a home near Chalbury, consisting of letters and personal papers of Anne Bolton, a lay Methodist who corresponded with John Wesley. The archive was rich, but in complete disarray. I called on Cindy to come join me, and together we began to put the archive in order. I left the archive to her, and Anne Bolton is one of 3 figures now in her D.Phil thesis. But what I observed through all of this was her almost industrial ability to assess, organize, reconstruct, make connections, and sort out this material. Astonishing, really. I wanted to add a line to say, if there is anybody to organize your Tupperware drawer, it would be Cindy Aalders. She has recently finished her D.Phil on the religious lives of 18th century women, including a fascinating network of Methodist women, and I can certainly speak to the quality of her work, which she has presented to international academic meetings where it has been received well by senior scholars internationally. She has a number of publications to her name, including peer-reviewed articles and books, and I expect her D.Phil thesis to be published by Oxford University Press or a leading academic press. And now tonight we celebrate the fact that it has. Cindy, we're very proud of your accomplishment, so welcome with me Cindy Aalders to speak on her new book.
Well, thank you so much for coming to celebrate the publication of my book. And thanks also to those of you who've joined via the live stream, which I know includes family members and friends across time zones. Thanks also to you, Bruce, for agreeing to host this evening and for that really generous introduction and your offer to respond to the book a bit later. It does feel in some ways that I've opened myself up to your examination again, years after you were my professor here at Regent. Thanks also to Maxine Hancock, who was my first thesis supervisor here at Regent, who I know is watching now from her home in Alberta, and who sent these beautiful flowers today. And finally, thanks to all of those who did so much work behind the scenes to make tonight possible, especially Chandel Scaley, who is my administrative assistant in the library, as well as our official party planner. You have her to thank for the tea and scones afterward. So in the spiritual lives and manuscript cultures of 18th century English women, I explore a neglected tradition of women's writing, but one that is vital to understanding the place of women in the religious world of 18th century England. And of course, since women made up such a large part of the church, indeed the larger part, we can't really understand Christianity in 18th century England if we don't account for women's place in it. When I set out to study women's place in 18th century English Christianity, hey Tyler, it's not on the screen here. Is there an easy fix? When I set out to study women's place in 18th century Christianity, I found that most of the studies I was reading located women within the institutions of church and family. In these studies, women tend to emerge on the one hand as wife and mother, and on the other as so-called exceptional women who overcame gendered constraints to find their way into print and the public, which at the time, and the pulpit, which at the time were still very much the domain of men. As interesting as these studies are, it seemed obvious to me that a lot of women remained unaccounted for in such narratives. I wanted to discover more about how these missing women were active in Christian communities, including church communities. And I wanted to capture something also of women's internal worlds, the spiritual lives of my title. This is working. The manuscript cultures of my title suggest my method. I went to the archive to read their own words. Because what better way to understand 18th century women's religious lives, or indeed women's lives of any period, including our own, than to listen to women? So I spent many happy hours in the archive reading women's letters, diaries, and other personal writings, writings that collectively are referred to as life writings by historians and literary scholars. As my study deepened, I was fascinated to find that the manuscripts themselves were central to the story of women's active participation in 18th century religion that I had set out to investigate. What I discovered is contained in my subtitle, Writing Religious Communities. The phrase is a double entendre. It has a double meaning. First, the phrase is descriptive of the communities in which my research subjects participated, and I'll introduce you to those subjects in a moment. Women wrote letters to each other, they exchanged diaries, and they addressed affectionate poetry to friends and family. These religious communities wrote. They wrote out of love for one another, even as they wrote to encourage faith, to challenge and educate, to empathize, and to urge continued trust in God, even in times of suffering. Whether separated by distance or near to each other, they wrote to maintain emotional and spiritual ties that bound them together in religious communities. And secondly, the phrase describes what their writing accomplished. It shaped religious communities and cultures. These women wrote religious communities. Their writing provided a text by which their contemporaries and later generations learned religious life and language. In this way, women's life writings complemented certain formalized means of culture formation, like listening to ministers or reading religious books, such that through writing, women engaged in the creative act of shaping religious cultures. It's great, Tyler. It's back, yeah. Women's life writings both emerged from spiritual communities and undergirded those communities. Women both inherited and created religious communities. What I'd like to do tonight is tell you a few stories to show you how women did this. Now, if you read the book, you'll be introduced to a lot of women, young and old, wealthy and worried about money, living in villages and large cities, and of different religious denominations and theologies. But at the center of the book are three women, Catherine Talbot, Anne Steele, and Anne Bolton. All the other women and men in the book are there only on account of their connections to Talbot, Steele, and Bolton. So let me introduce them to you briefly. First, Anne Steele. She was born in the village of Broughton in Hampshire and lived there her entire life. No image of her survives, sadly, but we can imagine that's her seated in the white dress in this early photo of the garden terrace at her home in Broughton. Steele's family had been Baptists for generations, and her father and great uncle were ministers at the local Baptist church where she worshiped throughout her life. Her father and later her brother were also successful timber merchants, and by the mid-18th century, the Steeles had become the wealthiest family in the neighborhood. The family was also remarkably literary, and from a young age, Steele wrote poems on both familial and religious themes. As she aged, she also began to compose hymns, some of which were sung in the local Baptist church. In 1760, she published 2 volumes of her hymns and poems as Poems on Subjects Chiefly Devotional by Theodosia. But Steele's hymns were the subject of my first book, as Bruce said, and not my primary focus here. In this book, I'm more interested in the poems she wrote on a wide range of subjects, as well as her correspondence with friends and family, a good deal of which have been retained in a vast multi-generational family archive that is preserved at the Angus Library at Regent College in Oxford. I also tracked down related manuscript materials elsewhere, including at Trowbridge Museum, which is a little museum located in a shopping mall near Bath, where I was startled to encounter this. Let's move on. Catherine Talbot had an eminent Anglican genealogy and was brought up at the heart of the established church, or the Church of England. Her father was an archdeacon when he died 5 months before she was born, after which her pregnant mother went to live with her friend Catherine Benson, after whom baby Catherine was named. Catherine Benson soon married Thomas Secker, who would become the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Talbots became part of the Seckers household until their deaths. So Talbot lived for much of her life in ecclesiastical homes and palaces, mostly in London. Her life was comfortable and privileged, and she spent her days reading, painting, writing, and in an endless round of social visits. Talbot wrote from an early age, and as a young girl achieved a reputation as a prodigy, as her poems and letters circulated in manuscript when she was still a child. Later in life, she wrote essays that were published posthumously as reflections on the 7 days of the week and essays on various subjects. She also kept a diary and was a dedicated correspondent. My hunt for Talbot's manuscripts and related writings took me to many places, including Alnwick Castle, where I was settled into a circular room high in a turret overlooking the keep as large volumes of manuscripts were brought to me. And that is not a bad research gig. Bruce, can you beat that? No. And then finally, Anne Bolton. She was born in the market town of Witney in Oxfordshire and spent most of her long life living either there or in the nearby village of Finstock. Her father was a brewer and/or baker, her brother a farmer, and she was often drawn into their worlds of work. She carried a higher level of fiscal responsibility and work-related anxiety than either Talbot or Steele. Belonging to a lower social stratum with considerably more demands on her time, Bolton did not record the pleasures of walking, painting, and writing poetry, or reading within a close family circle. In her late teens, she converted to Methodism, and her writing life appears to have begun around this time. Her prolific writings would eventually include conversion narratives, sermon notes, commonplace books, and many, many letters. She also wrote an extraordinary diary over a period of 30 years, almost 1,300 manuscript pages of which survive. This is the material that Bruce was mentioning. The vast majority of Bolton's manuscripts, including her diary, many of her letters, and some miscellaneous documents, remain in private hands, including at the home of Lady Bolton, where I made her dining room my office, her words, at least weekly for more than a year. Earlier, I said that I went to the archive to learn more about how women were active in writing religious communities. But clearly these women's papers haven't survived in a singular archive, nor even what one might recognize as an archive at all. I've just shown you photos of a shopping mall, a castle, and a private home. Though to be sure, my research for related manuscripts also brought me to more formal archives at the Bodleian in Oxford, the British Library and Lambeth Palace Library in London, John Rylands Library in Manchester, Trinity College Library in Dublin, the Huntington Library in California, the Beinecke Library at Yale, and elsewhere, including local church archives and public record offices across England. I tell you all of this because I want to give you a sense of my own journey in searching for Steele, Talbot, and Bolton, and their friendship and kinship networks, and the effort required to puzzle out their lives and hear their voices. The challenge wasn't that there weren't enough extant manuscripts, but that earlier archivists and historians did not consider these women or their papers important enough to warrant organization and analysis. What's interesting to me is that the women I've studied did think that their words were important and were active themselves in their papers' preservation. Yet often the manuscripts I turned up to read were uncatalogued or only minimally catalogued. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, I encountered 29 boxes filled with 18th and 19th century manuscripts related to Anne Steele, for which there was no finding aid. So I opened one box after another and began to make my own list of what I found inside. Opening one envelope, I found 20 or so slips of paper with names written on them, each folded neatly around a lock of hair as a memento of friendship. and that was a lovely surprise. In another, I found an ancient spider, not so lovely. I spent over a year visiting Lady Bolton because Anne Bolton's diary was in more than 100 pieces, most of which were incompletely dated, which is a result of her diary writing method. And it took a really long time to reconstruct it. I built family trees based on diaries and letters. I mapped lives onto a large map laid out on the floor of my tiny Oxford flat. I created timelines of correspondences using spreadsheets, and I loved every minute of it. So in the time I have remaining, I'd like to take you on a walk through the book, telling a few stories about what I found along the way. Late in the 18th century, Nancy Overbury wrote a letter to Mary Whitaker, a cousin several times removed from Anne Steele, that said, "Will you not favor me with a visit this summer? I think you could not come at a time when I more need the conversation and advice of a spiritual friend." Sorry. So my first chapter, The Encouragement of Spiritual Friends, I explore the rich variety of spiritual friendship enacted within intra-generational relationships, asking how women within a peer group, such as Nancy Overbury and Mary Whitaker, use letters, diaries, and other life writings to learn religious belief and life together. While historians have observed the importance of women's friendship in supporting public activity, including religious activity, friends also played important and under-acknowledged roles in supporting a more personal, interior faith. Anne and Mary Steele, half-sisters as well as friends, used correspondence and poetry to support each other emotionally and spiritually. They lived together until 1749, when Mary, then 25 years old, got married and moved about 10 miles away. Within a few months of her marriage, Mary Wakeford, began to regret not her marriage, but the lack of religious conversation in her new situation. And she wrote to Steele proposing a correspondence in which, quote, "some little part of our time be spent in freely writing our serious thoughts to each other." She hoped that such a correspondence would provide spiritual stimulation and support no longer available to her in person. And Steele agreed, describing the goal of their correspondence, "You and I, my dear Mary, let us endeavor to encourage each other in the journey by talking of the glorious person who has wrought such wonders of surprising love." While they wished they could speak in person, Steele cheered herself, writing, "It is, however, in my power to talk a little on paper, but what shall be the subject?" They quickly developed a pattern for their correspondence. One or the other would suggest a topic, and they would each enlarge on it, turn by turn, letter by letter, occasionally incorporating poetry. In this way, they creatively worked out the Calvinistic piety that they had been taught and heard preached from childhood. In one letter, Steele took as her subject the resemblance of the human heart to a garden. The theme emerged from her own immediate surroundings. She had just walked through her brother's garden and recalled the care that had been taken in weeding it. Conveying Calvinistic absorption with human sinfulness, Steele now reflected on the noxious, worthless weeds that choked her own heart. She wrote, "Many weeds rise, perhaps unnoticed. Some with feeble effort I attempt to pull up, and sometimes think I have succeeded, but soon find myself mistaken. They spring again and convince me that the root was left behind." Developing her garden analogy, Steele turned to God, the diligent gardener, to root out weeds and so cleanse her from sin, concluding that her own laboring for salvation would be in vain if not for God's sovereign grace. She concluded her letter asking, "Let me have your thoughts in return." And in her reply, Wakeford recast Steele's reflections in terms of her own surroundings, the more domestic scene of a chaotic house. But her conclusion was the same. How difficult, how impossible rather, is it for a person to cleanse and rectify the least defilement, the smallest disorder of the heart? Yet, more than rehearsing Baptist theology as they had inherited it, their friendship and correspondence enabled Steele and Wakeford to probe theological ideas, experimenting with images and vocabulary and testing the implications of these ideas for their spiritual lives. Having grown up Baptist, Steele and Wakeford now learned to use Calvinistic language in new and nuanced ways. On the one hand, Steele articulated a conventional Calvinistic understanding of sin and salvation by assuming a passive role in response to God's divine agency. That is, God, as gardener, removed sin, weeds, from her heart, the soil. On the other hand, Steele sometimes cast herself in the role not of soil, but as gardener. As gardener, she actively labored to root out choking weeds by personal effort. In this analysis, God supplied the conditions by which she worked: seasonable showers and cheering sunshine, or the winter of adversity. Together, the sisters engaged in an extended theological meditation on the relationship between divine and human agency in salvation and sanctification. Steele and Wakeford's correspondence enabled an ongoing intellectual reflection on their shared faith, but it also provided very personal encouragement for Wakeford when she was lonely and felt unsupported. By 1757, Wakeford had been married for 8 years and had 2 young sons, aged 4 and 5. She found her domestic situation difficult, and she continued to feel the distance from her friends and family at Broughton. She missed the emotional and psychological support of those who knew and loved her well. But she also felt a painful lack of spiritual support, so she wrote to Steele, "I have had no one but our children to talk with, and how insipid and tiresome is empty tittle-tattle for several days together. One afternoon I was at Mrs. Bray's, but though with the aged there should be wisdom, it does not always appear to be so. There is no one here who has so much friendship for me as to seek to do my soul good by religious conversation." In response, Steele offered encouragement in the kind of religious conversation that Wakeford lacked at Andover, where her conflicted and often frustrating experience of motherhood points to an alternative to the stereotyped and sentimental representations of motherhood that have led some historians to identify an increasingly powerful cult of maternity from the early 18th century. While Wakeford was exasperated by what she called the children's perversenesses, and grew weary of their childish prattle, and older women in the neighborhood disappointed her desire for spiritual guidance, her correspondence with her sisters supplied her need for a spiritual friend. In 1763, Catherine Talbot wrote to Eliza Berkeley following an illness of Berkeley's aging mother-in-law. "I am always hurt when I hear old age represented unjustly as going downhill. It is indeed going up so high a hill as may well put persons out of breath and make them faint and weary. But the encouraging prospect brightens at every step, and assisting angels stretch out a helping hand." So in my second chapter, The Wisdom of Spiritual Elders, I consider the often hidden ways in which women acted as spiritual elders in religious communities. Focusing on relationships across generations, I consider those to whom women looked for spiritual guidance and ask how the exchange of letters and other life writings supported mentoring relationships. By describing older women as spiritual elders, I am deliberately invoking the church office of elder, for the unofficial religious guidance provided by older women has clear resonances with the official responsibilities of church elders to superintend the spiritual welfare of congregations. In both capacities, elders were entrusted with the care of souls. In formal settings, this trust was conferred by ecclesial structure or voting members. In informal ones, it was bestowed by affection and freely given within personal relationships. While the religious leadership of some older women was hidden and is perceptible now only through their and others' life writings, that of the Methodist Mary Fletcher had two phases. One was widely visible to the English Methodist world, and the other more hidden. The first included her public philanthropic work, as well as her activities as a Methodist preacher and published writer. And this has attracted much scholarly attention. There was a brief period in the 18th century as Methodism was growing as a movement when exceptional, so-called exceptional women were permitted to preach. But by the 1790s, Fletcher was widowed, and her age and health required a shift in her activity. She developed an informal ministry of religious counsel from her home in Madeley, Shropshire. This second, more hidden leadership she described in her diary in 1793. She wrote, "I am in the very place and situation where God would have me be. Many come to me from far and are like to do so more and more, and I will not shrink from it, for it is God's call. If I was to travel about, as I have sometimes done, I could do little because a small journey lays me up. But at home I can converse with many. I felt a renewed alacrity for the service of souls." While Fletcher's space contracted to her home in later life, her ministry did not shrink, it merely altered. Rather than going out to preach, Fletcher's reputation for wisdom and holiness caused her to be sought out as a spiritual elder. Anne Bolton met Fletcher at Madeley in 1797, although they had been corresponding since earlier in the decade. On Bolton and her husband's arrival at Madeley, they were welcomed into, quote, to quote Bolton, that is, the sacred peaceable mansion, and Bolton found that words failed her upon meeting Fletcher. "We were received by that blessed woman with such humble dignity, such benign courtesy, as I can by no means describe. I was perfectly struck with astonishment, and so I was the whole time we were with her." She attended to Fletcher with almost reverential awe. Fletcher's every word, she wrote in her diary, was distilled as the dew on my heart. When Fletcher prayed, Bolton recorded, the heavens seemed to shower down immediate blessings. Bolton's purpose in going to Madeley had been to seek Fletcher's guidance regarding her husband, George Conybeare. At issue was his uncertain spiritual state, which Bolton felt to be an ongoing burden. She had married him 5 years earlier, despite his not being a Methodist, and their formal marriage negotiations were preceded by Bolton's explicit efforts to test his religious seriousness while instructing him in the spiritual ideals and practices of Methodism. These are actually some funny letters. His letters to her say things like, "I've sent you a fish and beg you accept it as a token of my love." At another point, he sent her a whole wheel of cheese. Yeah, when I told one of my supervisors that, she said that would have worked for me. So Conybeare willingly submitted to this testing, and Bolton later wrote to Fletcher, "He married me that I might be his guide and leader to heaven." But 5 years later, his spiritual estate remained unresolved, so Bolton brought him to someone of greater spiritual authority. Fletcher met with them throughout their visit to offer advice and guidance, and on the third day of their visit, she introduced some letters written by her late friend, Sarah Ryan, who, like Fletcher, had been a Methodist preacher. Bolton recorded in her diary, "Those letters were full of energetic power and of the Holy Spirit." Through letter and visit, prayer and conversation, and sharing the manuscripts of now dead friends, Bolton sought and found spiritual guidance from one she referred to as a minister of God for good to me. Rather than precipitating a retreat from meaningful engagement in communal life, advanced age could lead to older women achieving honored positions as spiritual elders within religious communities. When her daughter Anna was perhaps 6 or 7, Jane Atwater wrote a note to her and slipped it into her diary. "My dear child, now you have with diligence and attention thus far acquitted yourself in learning to read, to spell, and repeat your catechisms and hymns. But do not think, my dear girl, that you now have done all that is your duty to do. No, you have through your future life to reduce into practice the good instructions you have been favored with at the Sunday school and in a more private way." So in my third chapter, The Instruction of Spiritual Children, I analyze the often hidden efforts of women to communicate religious ideals and ideas to much-loved children and to encourage their spiritual development. The chapter explores who nurtured children spiritually and how the exchange of letters, diaries, and poetry supported an intergenerational transmission of faith. While historians have tended to privilege the role of parents and church leaders in providing religious education, my research showed that a range of female relatives and friends, notably aunts and single women, played vital roles in the religious instruction of children. Looking beyond the home and nuclear family reinforces the importance of literary interactions as an ongoing, innovative means of instruction. The transmission of spiritual ideals and the formation of the young owed as much to women's instruction through life writings as to the more formal and well-known activities listed in Atwater's letter. One of the ways this religious training proceeded was in diaries, which were sometimes used as an innovative and effective site of interactive religious instruction. Religious diaries have often been understood as a distinctively private genre, a space for self-examination within which writers could safely expose the inner secret movements of the soul. At the same time, scholars have tended to stress the self-concern of women's diaries, highlighting their function as a liberating space within which women could escape demands on their time, constraints on their lives, to focus on themselves, cultivating their minds and hearts in isolation. But Catherine Talbot's diary practice radically complicates these notions of religious women's diaries as private and self-concerned. It performed a social purpose that was no less personal for not being private. Talbot never married and had no children of her own, but she became a spiritual mother to a number of girls, including 15-year-old Julia Berkeley, whose father died suddenly in 1753. Talbot was particularly attentive to Julia at this time and grew deeply attached to her, referring to her affectionately as my daughter and my Julia. Julia's mother still lived, but Talbot's flexible and capacious sense of family allowed her to write to Julia of all her mamas and grandmamas who loved and cared for her. Talbot's program of religious education with Julia not only included comprehensive guidance on how to keep a diary, but transpired within the shared space of exchange diaries. In an effort to instill her spiritual ideals of personal piety and holy living in her much-loved younger friend, Talbot set Julia the task of keeping a diary, which she then submitted to Talbot for comment and correction. Talbot wanted to teach Julia to live mindfully and not idly, and to be religiously serious without becoming excessively grave or sober. And to navigate this balance, Talbot practiced and subsequently taught Julia an exacting method of accounting for how she used every hour of the day. Talbot was patient with Julia's early efforts, explaining that it requires some time to get into a right method, and she encouraged her, writing, "Your journal, my love, be as long as it will. The longer it is, the more pleasure it will give me." Talbot's fond addresses communicate her personal motivation in translating her faith to Julia by teaching her the right method to account for her time so live a pious life. And to help Julia understand what was required of her, Talbot sent her sections of her own carefully executed diary as a pattern to follow, thereby directing her own self-reflection toward religious instruction. The diary sent to Julia is partly an account of hours spent and partly a more discursive reflection on Talbot's thoughts, reading, and social interactions. It often reads as a letter, and indeed the way in which the diary could conflate with letters in the period is signaled by the way these sections are folded and addressed on the outside, pour la chère Julie, for dear Julia. By sharing her diary in this way, Talbot provided Julia with both textual example and personal pattern. Indeed, part of her motivation in writing was to help her younger friend, her daughter, to self-reflect and narrate, hoping that in so doing, she would pass on to Julia her own deeply held religious beliefs. While some of Talbot's diary appears to have been delivered by hand, other sections were sent through the post, including sections written when Talbot was visiting the Duchess of Somerset, who acted as a spiritual elder in Talbot's life. And in these sections cataloged for Julia the books that Talbot read and modeled her method of making reflective notes on her reading. And it's striking how Talbot's book discussions with the Duchess informed her instruction of Julia. That is, Talbot's relationship with the spiritual elder guided her relationship with her spiritual child. When Talbot and the Duchess read Jacques Duguay together at Percy Lodge, Talbot reflected on their shared reading in her diary, and these reflections were then sent on to Julia. Talbot included notes to Julia, such as, "Let me give you a rule or two from Abbé Duguay," and then transcribed for her an extract from his book of letters. It would be useful to you to live one moment at a time and to forget everything that preceded it and that must follow. Abandon yourself to divine providence, unloading the weight of yourself and all that surrounds you. Do not lose courage. Such efforts to trust in providence and actively to seek contentment by suspending one's own immediate wishes and fears form a recurrent theme in Talbot's life writings. By directing Julia to this passage, she offered spiritual comfort and guidance to a girl still grieving the death of her father. She also demonstrated for Julia her method of making extracts as an aid to reflective reading. Following a significant experience in Anne Bolton's spiritual life, she recorded it in her diary not only as a reminder to herself of God's faithfulness, she also conceived of her experience and her recounting of it as having enduring meaning. And so she committed it to paper also for the benefit of unknown future readers. She wrote, "Let this be remembered to the Redeemer's glory, the encouragement of my own soul, and all that shall ever read it." So my fourth and final chapter, Life Writing as Spiritual Legacy, explores the afterlives of religious women's life writings. Looking beyond their contemporary uses, here I ask how manuscripts functioned in religious communities after the death of their authors. Scholars of manuscript cultures have highlighted the ways in which an historiographical emphasis on print culture, books, has obscured women's engagement in 18th century intellectual and literary worlds. I wanted to know, what does the consideration of manuscript cultures reveal regarding women's engagement in 18th century religious worlds? By tracing manuscripts across generations, we find that as women's writings continued to be read and cherished as spiritual legacy, they formed community memory and shaped religious identity. The women considered in my book all wrote for posterity. They all did. Whether they wrote with an anonymous future reader in mind, like Anne Bolton here, or a particular loved individual, they all wrote with the hope that their words would be read and would bear spiritual fruit. Their life writings served the immediate purpose of giving shape and meaning to their own spiritual lives, but they also were constructed with consideration for the future. Women were not simply passive participants in keeping and passing on religious meaning through the posthumous publication by others of their letters and diaries. They intentionally wrote and actively prepared their own writings for a future readership. In many ways, these women's writings came to constitute the collective memory of the religious communities. Drawing a connection between memory and religion, Danielle Herveau-Leger argues that the authority of priests lies partly in their ability to mobilize and, quote, expound the true memory of the group. So in their concern for the preservation of their writings, women could be seen as performing quasi-priestly functions, refracted, of course, by particular social and denominational contexts. It is the uniqueness and personal quality of their authors' histories and experiences, rather than any claim to representativeness or institutional authority, which infused these writings with meaning. Letters, diaries, and familial poetry brought to mind friends and family, now dead, and in their textual representations of real-life joys and struggles, later readers found inspiration and guidance for their own religious lives. Their authority was found as much in their familiarity as in their heroic religious example. Women's writings therefore represent an alternative to more official contemporary narratives. Personal narratives, the testimony of a witness, imbued women's life writings with power to shape religious identities and communities posthumously. Not only their words, but the material nature of women's life writings constituted religious memory and shaped spiritual communities. Manuscripts themselves might be said to constitute lieu de mémoire, where what Pierre Nora considers sites for anchoring a group's memory, the embodiment of memory in certain sites where a sense of historical continuity persists, that is, places where memory crystallizes. Women's manuscripts can be seen as sites for anchoring the communal memory of religious communities. This can be seen particularly clearly in the Steele Archive and its associated papers. On several occasions, Jane Atwater recorded reading her late great-aunt Anne Cater Steele's diary, that is, Anne Steele's stepmother. And in it, she found a source of spiritual guidance and a sense of her place in her family's generational faith. So in 1786, shortly after her own mother died, Atwater turned to her great-aunt's diary, expressing a particular interest in her mother's representation in the diary. She transcribed these sections into her own diary. The past week, I've been reading my honored Aunt Steele's diary. May it tend to quicken me in religious duties, wherein she was so diligent, speaking of my dear and honored parent in May 1739. She says, Cousin Atwater came, had a good deal of sweet, agreeable talk with my niece, she designing, God willing, to offer herself to the church the ensuing day in order to be baptized. Thus far my aunt's recital of what concerned my dear mama at that time. Reading these old family papers provided a sense of connection with her past and of her place in her faith heritage, and it restored her lost mother of almost 50 years earlier, then about the same age as Atwater was as she read the diary. When Atwater read her great-aunt's diary, Anne Cater Steele had been dead for 26 years. Her niece could not have known her well, for she was 7 years old and lived about 15 miles away when her aunt died. Atwater's use of the diary confirms Cater Steele's honored place in family memory, as well as the authority imbued in her diary and its posthumous influence on the communal life of her overlapping familial and religious community. As she had guided the spiritual life of her family while living, the material artifact of her diary continued to shape the life of this extended Baptist family. When Jane Atwater picked up Anne Cater Steele's diary, she encountered a history of her family's religious life together. Merging spiritual diary and family chronicle, personal reflection was integrated with a collective record of her family's religious life as it occurred. When Cater Steele's niece, Jane Gibbs, who was sister to Jane Atwater's mother, I should have included a family tree here, I think. When Jane Gibbs was in Broughton in 1751, her aunt was instrumental in guiding her to the decision to be baptized. Anne Cater Steele wrote in her diary that her niece was very subject to be surprised, and so Gibbs requested that she be permitted to write her spiritual experience rather than give it extempore in front of the Broughton church. And this written experience is preserved on a sheet tucked into Anne Cater Steele's diary. Other written records are variously tucked, pinned, and stitched into the diary, including hymns by her stepmother, Anne Steele, with the dates on which they were sung in the local church, the tombstone epigraph of a long-dead relative, and poetry written by her stepson, William Steele. The inclusion and preservation of these documents denotes Cater Steele's diary as a collage of her family's collective religious identity, an intimate and richly layered portrayal of communal religious life. And yes, that is what I had to read. No margins, no white space. Perhaps taking her cue from her great aunt, Jane Atwater's diary similarly represents a layering of religious experience and family connections. It contains poetry addressed to friends, letters to and from family members, and fragments of both her mother's and her daughter's diaries, who both predeceased her. Atwater's mother kept a diary that survives only in fragments tucked inside her daughter's diary, and these insertions occurred at times of personal anxiety. When Atwater's daughter Anna died at the age of 16, Atwater documented her declining health and eventual death in poignant detail. And alongside her own journalistic account, she slipped a page from her mother's diary. You can see that page on the left. She too, her mother too, had lost a child over 50 years earlier, and she recorded the event in her diary, writing, "The death of my dear little babe was a sharper affliction than anyone can think it was." So then in conversation with her mother's earlier entry, we have Atwater's on the right, where you can also see that she pinned in a note in the bottom corner there, having reread her diary years later and wanting to make some comments and corrections. So in Atwater's diary, we read, "My beloved Anna departed this life about half after 12, O solemn day ever to be remembered, with the keenest anguish." Her mother had known what she now suffered, and her earlier efforts to practice pious resignation now guided Atwater's response to her own loss. So there are a lot of things I could say by way of conclusion. And really the hardest thing about preparing for tonight was just deciding what to say, because there's so much I could. But perhaps I'll limit myself by asking how gender informed these women's literary activities. In searching for motivations for their activities, one might look for proto-feminist impulses that look to religious belief as authorization for women's expression at a time when their voices were often muffled or silenced. Anne Steele articulated concern for the equal education of women. In a poem, she wrote, "Why is woman thus depressed and scorned by tyrant men? If we're less wise than they, 'tis their own fault who cramp our education." It's much longer, but. Generally, the women considered in this book did not obviously resist oppressive or hierarchical structures or make overt claims to power. nor do they typically interpret their spirituality in explicitly gendered terms. So Elizabeth Ritchie once encouraged Anne Bolton's sense of pastoral responsibility by writing to her, "The dear people want a spiritual mother amongst them. You are called to nurse the lambs and feed the sheep." Yet such a feminized rendering of their activity was uncommon. To what extent, then, is the expression and activity analyzed in my book that of women? The archives I explored revealed women's greater, though not exclusive, tendency to use life writings in such informal and interpersonal ways, as well as women's extensive efforts to preserve those manuscripts. It appears to have been the women in these communities who more often use life writings to encourage and educate, and who are moved to preserve those encounters. In this sense, a female spiritual practice has been illuminated. But the self-conscious carving out of a gendered role did not drive their literary activities. Rather, they were motivated primarily by deeply held religious beliefs. Rather than being driven by a will to break free from social or religious constraints, these women engaged in informal literary activities within and alongside church structures. So my book is not an account of women overcoming social or religious constraints to engage public fields of education or philanthropy, nor of women nobly performing often overlooked roles within the home. Rather, it offers fresh perspective on the presence and participation of women in religious cultures by attending closely to their activities as writers. Motivated by deep faith, love for others, and a powerful impulse to write, Catherine Talbot, Anne Steele, and Anne Bolton performed personal and communal acts of devotion when they put pen to paper. They were actively involved in processes of self-examination and self-expression by which they, in effect, wrote themselves. But in so doing, they also wrote religious communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you for the privilege and the honor of inviting me to respond, make a few comments, and then we'll open it up for the rest of you. Let me just make a few comments that try to point to some of the significance of what I think Cindy has done, and just to open it up a little bit. First of all, I just want to identify what an exemplary monograph she's written and what distinguished archival research and historical reconstruction she has done that is so far beyond the scale of a typical monograph or a PhD thesis in any way. There is a mountain, there are thousands of manuscripts that are like, 7/8 of the iceberg that are underneath. It's a massive amount of research. I just need to pause to emphasize that. And it's research that is recovering, as I think Cindy has indicated, like voices that we need to hear that are just so rare to find, this kind of thing. But not only so, like I just want to say, like this is industrial scale research, researchers' research. And I mean, I love this. I'm an archival historian. I read dead people's mail for a living. I just love this kind of thing. And she does it better than anybody. But beyond that, it's beautifully written. I can't emphasize, the book is beautifully written, not a word misplaced, sustains beautiful narrative arcs and themes and analysis without getting lost in the details. One of the dangers when you do this much research is just data dumping, right? It is not like that. I just can't emphasize enough that this book reads with a beautiful literary quality. The narratives Cindy drops you down into, you wouldn't know they're entirely reconstructed from like just dumping out a whole puzzle piece and trying to put it back together and then telling this beautiful story. And also very artfully blending these stories together. It's not just like 1, 2, 3, but all the stories are woven together. The main protagonist, the supporting characters, pressing theological concerns, literary analysis, all done together. It's wonderful. David Steinmetz, the great Reformation historian at Duke, said the historian's job is, it's a small job, it's to resurrect the dead. And I think that's what Cindy has done in giving us these stories. How wonderful. And like her earlier book on Anne Steele, it treats the spiritual lives of its subjects seriously and without anachronism. She lets her subjects come alive and speak in their own proper voices, so we really do hear them. It's a book of micro-histories, and I should say that how significant this kind of work can be historically. It took me a long time to figure out in the UK why some books of local history were considered really important history books. And I go Methodist and Oldham and Saddleworth in 1760s, like, why is that an important book? Local history is used to test some of the big ideas. You have these big historical ideas, and then it gets tested with this kind of local exacting history, like, is it actually true? And I feel like Cindy's book has done that. And these micro-histories are testing narratives. She's widely read in the literature of the period, the secondary sources, the scholarship. And so she's making a significant contribution to discussions in a number of disciplines. She does it elegantly. She does it just on the fly. But I fully expect the book will be reviewed in literary critical journals, in historical journals, in religious studies journals, in at least those three kinds of journals. And here are just a few of the kinds of contributions that I think it makes. It makes a contribution to literary criticism and literary history, life writing, personalia, poetry, scribal publication, the genre of the 18th century letter, diaries, and manuscript culture. So all sorts of ways that literary historians are going to find this absolutely fascinating. To religious history, including the denominational histories of the established church in the 18th century, Methodism, Baptist, so-called New Descent, and the Evangelical Revival. Probably, in some ways, centrally, I think, 18th century spirituality, including lay religious experience, spiritual friendship and direction, themes like assurance, resignation, holy living. These are key themes in 18th century spirituality. Of course, gender and women's history, with a revisionist challenge that you maybe heard here already to separate spheres, ideology, and a view of religion as simply instrumental or emancipatory against patriarchal constraints. There's something more going on here. And I love the recovery of not just the heroic, but the familiar. It's beautiful. And fifthly, I wrote also to the history and writing about modern self-identity, a revisionist challenge to the simple notion of writing as instrumental of the individualist self-identity, but to find something more intersubjective, interpersonal, and community building. Those are just a few areas. This is not activist scholarship. There's a place for activism, but this is not a matter of using historical subjects as ciphers for a political argument or as proxies for ideological battles in the present, nor does it build up a huge pyramid of theory that rests on a tiny, tiny point of historical data. I've read those books. Cindy wants to show us the lives and writings of these women, the communities they foster in their own terms. And I can't emphasize enough, she took her time. She took her time to do it right. And it takes time to do this kind of work. If we understand gender as the social aspect of biological sex, then there is something important here about the way these religious women, as women, whose interior lives were fundamentally devout and oriented towards spiritual ends first and foremost, the way they created, nurtured, and sustained these spiritual communities across generations, or as Cindy says, they wrote these communities. I think one of the images that came to mind, Cindy, was it's like an underground aquifer. You have all the vegetation and the things that are growing on the surface, and it's the underground aquifer that is nourishing all this life on the surface. And you've exposed that underground aquifer. I think Catherine Breckus at Harvard did something like this in reconstructing the world of Sarah Osborne, a religious colonial woman in Rhode Island. But I am not aware of anyone that has done anything quite like this, using comparative and parallel histories that work across denominational, occupational, and class lines, and interweaves this in quite this kind of way, and in such a beautiful way. The communities Cindy has discovered and written, she's also written communities, were, as it were, para-institutional, existing alongside and perhaps even underneath formal structures of religious organizations such as the parish, the class meeting, or the chapel. Kinship ties were as much spiritual as they were biological, and such communities transcended the public-private distinction, just like the personal letter, the familiar letter itself did. Scribal publication, letters are often read publicly, and so on. Diaries, poems, letters, memoirs, ephemera, all of this writing served to create, sustain, express, and reflect discernible communities that were personal, a category important, I think, to Cindy, beyond just sort of public or private. Something more like we would say here in Regent, theologically, persons in relation, rather than a network with junction boxes or switches. So it's a remarkable achievement, Cindy, and we really celebrate the work you've done. You know, you maybe heard the expression, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter book. It's hard to write a book, like, I think it's just exactly the right length, and it could easily have been like 5 times the length, and you would have gotten completely lost, but it actually reads beautifully just the way it is. I thought I would raise just a couple questions, and these are not to take anything away from the completeness of what you've done, Cindy, but I was just thinking about some of the things I've read in other archives and comparing and things I go, okay, help me understand the way that's unique or the distinctive of this archive. How do we determine the relative significance of gender without comparison to other domestic archives of men and women? I'm thinking of like the family archives of the Thorntons and the Wilberforces that Christopher Tolley has written about. I think there's a family archive of George Wannsee, the Presbyterian, that passed down the male line rather than the female line. But I'm just wondering how some of this would pop, what would look distinctive, and also how many of the things that we're seeing as the unique formation of self in society are things that are also more widely characteristic of the great age of the familiar letter, and the nature of 18th century has been described the great age of friendship, the great age of the personal letter, and there's something going on here that is even wider than what we see displayed so beautifully in this book. But I wonder, Cindy, do you want to take a minute? Just you can respond to that if you would like, or would you just like to other questions? What's that? Open it up? Okay. You can think about that. So thank you again, Cindy. We're open for questions that you have for Cindy about the writing of this book, about the book itself. There's a microphone here at the back. You can go to the microphone.
You've described a number of familiarities and similar things to the modern age, being the need for deep friendships, the getting annoyed at being near the tittle-tattle of children for way too long without a break, and the women not being impressed by the presentation of an awesome fish. But I was wondering if you had noticed anything in this very different time and place of what feels distinct and different about the voices of these women and the women when they're dealing with spirituality, and what you see in the lives of the real women in your own life, and what feels distinct about them in this age compared to your own.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of points that I encountered in the archive that are familiar to our life today, and that's kind of beautiful in itself. And for me, it worked both ways, that familiarity, so that I could recognize, oh yeah, my sister used to talk about, the difficulty of being with children, her children. I'm pausing right now because I know that my niece is on the live stream, but just the difficulty of being like with childish kind of conversation all day when she has intellectual depth and interests. So I recognize that as similar. But I could also recognize things that I encountered in the archive that I didn't have words for in my present day, that I moved into the present because it made so much sense historically. So Catherine Talbot referring to Julia as my daughter, that kind of like flexibility of relationship. Another, Anne Steele and her niece, Mary Steele. Anne Steele was a second mother to Mary Steele, and they use that kind of language very intentionally. And I recognize that I have a second mother. And Maxine Hancock, who I also know is listening in, I have told her that she is a second mother to me. And it's like recognizing something in my life that had always been there, or had been there for a long time, but I didn't have language for it until I encountered it in the archive in the 18th century. What is distinct? I mean, they lived in a different world, so the context makes a difference. The language is very different. I can move more freely in the world than a lot of these women could, as do most of the women in my life. Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Cindy. Thank you very much. My question is, so the practice of exchanging diaries, I think, would sound terrifying today. And I was just wondering if this changed I was wondering about your thoughts about the evolving idea of friendship because of this.
Evolving idea of friendship in relation to sharing diaries?
Well, in relation to the closeness that this demonstrates these women would have, today was, I'd never exchanged diaries with anybody, so.
Yeah, that's something that people are pretty quickly surprised with when I talk about my work, the fact that diaries were kind of frequently shared. So into the 19th century, girls' diaries were often laid open on the sideboard for like visitors to read. And I mean, I have a number of different examples from my own work where diaries turned up in places you weren't expecting them. So in working with Anne Bolton's material, I picked up part of what I assumed was her diary and realized that the voice was off, like just like really different. And it took quite a bit of work to figure out whose diary that actually was. You know that story, Bruce? Cyrenide, yeah. That took me going to church archives and looking for baptismal records and all kinds of things. What it's made me think differently about is that I think that any of us actually, when we put pen to paper, things are leaving ourselves and are external to ourselves. I think that all of us probably think in some way about the fact that we're making it public. So any kind of notion of a diary as revealing the innermost, parts of oneself, I think is problematic because, just
Did
putting
any
something
of
on
them?
paper.
Did any of the women write in code or shorthand?
Thank you. Yes, in fact, they did.
Yeah.
There were, so Catherine Talbot used a code that needed to be cracked. She disguised the names of people and places. She also used nicknames. A lot of these women used nicknames and stylistic names really freely, so that Thomas Secker, who I said, went on to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, he was...
Sir Charles? No.
Sorry?
What was Charles? Sir Charles? No, that was...
No, he was Eugene.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Who turned up in the diary, Catherine Talbot's diary, as ENG:, which is like abbreviated Eugene, but I was reading 18th century handwriting, so for a long time I read it Eng. Before, like, it just took a long time with this diary before I realized, oh, that's the Archbishop of Canterbury. She also referred to him as the Shaw, kind of facetiously, I think. So, yeah, there are a lot of moves that these diarists could make to disguise certain things. I also encountered shorthand that I'm still actively trying to work out.
Byram shorthand?
No,
Yeah.
Gurney.
Okay.
I spent part of my sabbatical trying to learn 18th century shorthand, as you do. Blocking out, cutting out lines of diaries, just like missing bits of the diary. Yeah,
So they aren't always entirely transparent.
absolutely not.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I read a lot of Catherine Talbot's diary, where there was a character named Dory, and I was trying to figure out who on earth is Dory. And well into my work, I realized it was her pet dormouse. So that kind of changed everything. I had to go back and read again. Yeah.
Rachel.
Cindy, firstly, I just wanted to say, as a student at Regent, learning from you and being exposed to your scholarship, and particularly to the voices of women, has really strengthened my own sense of vocation. So thank you for esteeming these voices and reminding us that they matter.
Thanks, Rachel.
I'm struck by the importance of community to these women and the intentionality of communication in a time when communication was ostensibly not as easy as it is now. So have you thought about how we, and maybe women in particular, might emulate the writings of religious communities in our contemporary moment and show that kind of intentionality and investment in our friendships and in sharing our spirituality with one another?
Mm-hmm. Did you say that communication is more difficult now or then?
No, like it's easier now, and yet we don't seem to be as intentional about it.
Yeah. No, I think that we communicate in different ways now that don't lend themselves to the depth of a personal letter in the 18th century. So when we text each other, it's quick, it's often, but there isn't like the depth. So thinking about Anne Steele and Mary Wakeford purposely setting up this like kind of correspondence where they picked a theme, a spiritual theme, and they like discussed it at length. I don't know, can we revive that kind of a thing now?
Do you know how many of these were using private couriers? Because in the 18th century, the recipient typically paid the postage, which makes a difference. You feel like you can't just say, "What's up?"
What's up?
Yeah, right? You have to say
That'll be
something.
8 shillings.
Yeah. So would they have been using the postal system and the recipient paying often for the letter?
Yes, a lot of the times, yes, they would have been using the postal system. Catherine Talbot was a little bit different. She could frank some letters and send them for free. But yeah, there were a lot of people.
That surely makes a difference, because it's too easy to correspond now, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
But they were better at it then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
David.
Congratulations, Cindy, on this major achievement. Proud of you.
Thank you, David.
I really appreciate how you spoke about their awareness of posterity in the writing that they were doing, diaries, but also letters and so on. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about their awareness or their consciousness of God and how that was manifest in the diary. So, for example, were the diaries written to God in the second person address? Was it you? Was it more third person address? Did they, in their letters, write out prayers for their friends? Just if you could speak a bit about how prayer and how address to God wove itself through the work.
Yeah, there's a lot of bleeding between genres and voice in these different genres. So diary, I don't know, there was something about it that lended itself to people like slipping into prayer. I don't know if you find that too.
All the time.
All the time, yeah. So suddenly, suddenly they're addressing God very explicitly, slipping into prayer. A lot of the diaries that I was working with addressed a daughter that it was being prepared for as well. So it was kind of like this shifting genre that was addressed to God, daughter, myself, an anonymous future reader. Yeah.
Sean Beckett.
I'll second what Rachel Hannah said. My question would be, could you speak a little bit more about how and when these women used poetry as spiritual encouragement to one another?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, you'd asked the poetry question. Yeah, I mean, as much as Anne Steele and her half-sister Mary would write letters on a theme, they would also, in company, write poetry on a theme, along with their brother. So it was this communal kind of poetry writing on devotional themes that was meant to be encouraging and deepening to the other people. There's a lovely set of poems called To a Watch Paper that the three of them wrote in company. And the added challenge, so a watch paper I learned, is a piece of paper that would be in like a watch that closed up, that you would put in a pocket or something. And the closing bit, you could put something in it. That was a watch paper. And so they would have tiny written poetry on circular pieces of paper about how they use their time. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. Colton.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks so much.
Hi. You're welcome.
And congrats.
Thank you.
You have spent, as you said, many hours and days in or help to, were the people to help guide your discoveries? Yeah, I'm just curious, kind of.
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, thank you very much. So Bruce and I both spent a week with Lady Bolton, Vanessa, whose home I had a picture of there. I got to know Vanessa quite well over the course of a year. She was and is an extraordinary woman. She's just fearless and amazing, and so very generous. I would take the train out to Charlbury, and she would pick me up every day and drop me back at the station at the end of the day. And very often didn't even come into the house with me. She'd just like set me free into her house, my office in her dining room, while she went out into the fields and like worked with the sheep. She was in her 70s, by the way. Yeah, and so I developed a lovely relationship with her and with her family as well. The whole Bolton family is so generous to me. I would be sitting in the dining room with the door closed, and I could hear Vanessa on the other side with her grandchildren, who I also got to know through it all. So it was this like lovely past, present meeting with me there. Vanessa Bolton was actually the youngest of three Bolton women that I got to spend some time with in their homes. I also went up to Yorkshire, where Nancy Rycroft, Nancy named for Anne Bolton. Nancy is like a derivative of Anne in the 18th century. And she was so excited to welcome me into her home, and actually sat beside me while I was reading a journal that she'd inherited. And we kept in touch until her death. She was in her 80s. And then Anne Logue, also named for Anne Bolton, was in her 90s when she welcomed me into her home in London, just like a grad student from Canada. Welcome in. She gave me a hard time on the phone before I arrived, though. She had inherited the courtship letters between Anne Boulton and George Conybeare, and she had no idea why I wanted to read them. They're just like about domestic stuff. It's not interesting at all. They were fascinating. So it was really wonderful to immerse myself into the Boulton family in the present, and be able to trace their history for them, and see their interest and their disinterest. Like, yeah, Vanessa never came in and sat beside us, or me for that whole year.
Hunt, and everybody had been in and out of the house, and somebody stole their Silver War silver collection and fenced it for £6 million. And it had gotten stolen. So when she said, "Don't steal the silver," she didn't mean just a little bit of silverware.
Yeah.
She meant English Civil War silver.
Amazing. Yeah.
Do you know if any of those archives, these wonderful family personal archives, are going to make it into public archives and be preserved? And like after all the hand listing and preservation work that you've done, I did some of that with you, but is any of that going to, like, I worry it's just going to get lost again?
I worry about that too. I think I need to renew my efforts with Vanessa. I talked to her quite a bit when I spent time with her that year, and she really had a sense that she married into the family. So it was her stepchildren's things to own, property,
I'm going to have a quick question about the archives.
Yeah.
So all the boxes that you went through and you cataloged for your own research, did any of those archives ask you, or did you provide them with the information from what were in the boxes so that they could create finding aids, or was it more of, thanks, that's good, but happy researching, you're on your way?
Thank you, Bronwyn, my friend, the archivist. I did, on a number of occasions, pass on information to archivists so that they could update their records. Even at, like, Alnwick Castle, I identified letters that they didn't know who the author was. At the Huntington Library, I did the same. At the Angus Library, I continually say, that's wrong, no, this is actually that person. And they love it when I come because I always, like, find new things that they had no idea that they had there. And so they're updating the records as I do my work.
Well, it's 8:30. I think Catherine Talbot, Anne Steele, and Anne Boulton have been very, very blessed in the historian that found them, and with what you've been able to do with all of this. So why don't you join me in a minute we're going to go out for tea and scones, but can you join me in thanking Cindy and congratulating her once more?
There it is.